The African Arts Institute has joined calls for Arts and Culture Minister Nathi Mthethwa to resign. The institute is accusing him of mishandling COVID-19 relief funds meant for artists. This comes after he released an independent report into 300 million rand in relief that was misallocated. It revealed that some applicants who were approved were given more than they applied for, and over 55% of the approved beneficiaries did not receive a cent. To discuss this further, the institute's executive director, Mike van Graan, joins us now. Mike, thank you so much for your time. So we heard the minister yesterday explain exactly how things went wrong, and they've laid out what they're going to do going forward. Are you happy with what you heard?
First of all, maybe just, Fuma, thanks for having me. And just to maybe make a correction, I'm here in my capacity as the executive member of the Theatre and Dance Alliance, which conducted a report into the PESB funding debacle in June of this year, given that so many of our members were directly affected by the NAC's mismanagement of that particular program. So we heard the minister's report, or his briefing based on the report, because we haven't seen the full report yet. And we think that, what has happened with this particular briefing is that the minister is finding maybe 4 or 5 scapegoats for this debacle, when in fact much greater responsibility for that particular debacle lies with him and his department. There are a few things that we need to bear in mind about the timing of this particular project. First of all, the NAC was given 5 months to do this project. They were given a letter at the end of October of last year to basically distribute 300 million rand by the end of March of this year. 5 months in which to distribute 3 times more funding than they normally receive. The NAC normally gets about 120 million rand a year. They have a full year to distribute that money. Now they were given 300 million rand to distribute within a matter of 5 months. There were also political imperatives for the distribution of that money. 100 million rand had to be used to retain 7,000 jobs, and 200 million rand was allocated for creating basically 10,000 new job opportunities. So it wasn't simply new, the normal kind of NAC funding where an applicant would apply, they would get funding for their project. They had to do it on the basis of them actually creating or retaining jobs. And the NAC had to prove that they had done this. Another complicating factor was that the NAC council was going to be replaced by the minister at the end of December last year. So normally at the end of the year when the NAC is winding down, they were in the midst of having to adjudicate more than 1,300 projects to receive funding from this 300 million rand.
Yeah.
And they were under pressure to basically complete all of that by 31st of December. The minister appointed a new council from the 1st of January of this year in the midst of these challenges. So the minister, in a way, has, relieved himself and his department and his political principles of any responsibility for the conditions that they created for the NAC to basically have to deliver on this 300 million rand allocation. There is no doubt that within the NAC, there were problems that led to the misallocation of funding, the over-budgeting and the like. And of course, those officials need to be held accountable. But we also need to bear in mind that the pressures that they were under were as the direct result of what the political principles in this particular case placed them under.
So, Mike, you lay the blame squarely at the minister's door. But let me play devil's advocate here. What do you say to someone who says, well, listen, if your boss gives you an imperative, even if it's tough, you've got to find a way to make it work. Should you blame the boss for the fact that you couldn't get your job done?
No, absolutely not. And that's why, in terms of one of the 6 key findings that we made in our report, we've made it very clear that the CEO and the CFO absolutely need to be held accountable. There is no ways that, they cannot be blamed for the debacle that occurred, as should the other staff as well, who were responsible and complicit in this, as were the other council members and the EXCO members in particular who signed off on the over-allocation of funding. We absolutely believe that they need to be held accountable. In fact, one of our recommendations is that should they be found to be responsible for what occurred, they need to be banned from holding public office within a cultural funding institution going forward, because the impact of their decisions on the sector was so devastating at a time when COVID-19, this pandemic, had decimated the sector in any case. So people were desperate to receive this funding. And the fact that they made such a huge bungle out of the allocation of the funding means that, they simply do not have any credibility in terms of continuing to play public roles in future.
I think it's good that we've seen, they're saying that people will be held accountable, but there is still the matter of the projects and the artists that need the money. So has there been any movement in that regard? What happens now?
So, yes, there has been movement. As per the briefing, I think 272 million rand has been allocated of the 300 million rand. 5% of that 300 million rand basically went to the NAC for the administrative costs. So about 15 million rand went to them. So in essence, 285 million rand was supposed to be distributed. According to the briefing, 272 million rand of that has been allocated. There's a balance of 13 million rand, and that's all good. I think the issue is not so much, and of course, it's fantastic that people have received funding. The issues have to do with the amounts of funding allocated and the timing of it. So the NAC and the minister have claimed that they've created more than 20,000 jobs as a consequence of them allocating this funding. We need to remember that when applications were made in November or October, November of last year, we were in lockdown level 1. And it was the most liberal of the lockdown levels within the pandemic. When they were required to implement these projects, we were in lockdown level 3 from the end of December last year through to about mid-February and so on. So many of those projects were unable to actually fulfill the tasks that they were given. And so for the NAC to claim that they had, basically created 20,000 new jobs, those are completely unaudited. We don't know if that actually happened. It was simply based on the formula that if you apply for so much funding, we'll assume that this is the number of jobs that you have created or retained in that process. So, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. I think the other thing we need to bear in mind, Dr. Fuma, is that the previous council actually provided grant notification letters to a bunch of arts organizations.
Yeah.
And then they, on the basis of those grant notification letters and the short time that they had to deliver the projects, they made bridging finance loans. And so they began to basically implement those projects so that they could deliver by the end of March of this year. When the new NAC came into being, they basically looked at this and said, well, actually, you know what? There's been an over allocation of funding. We're going to take this principled decision that everyone who is eligible for funding should get funding. So they unilaterally cut the funding of those who had received grant notification letters from the previous council, which placed them in hugely compromised positions, which is why an organization like the National Arts Festival, for example, took the NAC to court for having broken the contract. And won.
Mike,
unfortunately, there's smoke and mirrors.
Unfortunately, I have to cut you short there, Mike, but I think your point has been well made, and thank you for your time. I wish it wasn't a case of smoke and mirrors, and maybe we will get the ministry to speak more about this, even though they gave a briefing yesterday. Mike van Graan, thank you so much. He's the Executive Director of the African Arts Institute.